Alright guys, this will be video 1 for European history for Wednesday, March 25th. So we're picking up with Reformation. We're still in that first packet for period 1. I'm on the packet page 128. Why did Reformation succeed? Moving forward from there. Okay, so within 3 decades after Luther posted his 95 Theses, Protestantism had spread to many of the states of northern Germany, Scandinavia, England, Scotland, and parts of the Netherlands, France, and Switzerland. There are a number of possible explanations for this phenomenal success. Luther and the church that he founded were socially conservative and therefore not a threat to the existing social order. Luther's conservatism can be seen clearly in the Germans' Peasant Revolt, 1525. The revolt was the result of the German peasants' worsening economic conditions and their belief, articulated in the 12 Articles, that Luther's call for a priesthood of all believers was a message of social egalitarianism. It certainly was not. The revolt and the distortion of his ideas horrified Luther. He published a violently angry tract entitled Against the Robbing and Murderous Hordes of Peasants, in which he urged that no mercy be shown to the revolutionaries. Another reason Luther's movement was allowed to grow was that Luther was willing to subordinate his church to the authority of the German princes. As his response to the Peasants' Revolt shows, political questions were not of great importance to Luther, who felt that what occurred on this earth was secondary to what truly mattered, the kingdom of heaven. He was not critical of the German princes who created state churches under their direct control. Luther also encouraged German princes to confiscate the lands of the Catholic Church, and many rulers did not have to be asked twice, in part because 1/4 of all land in the Holy Roman Empire was under church control. Political issues within the Holy Roman Empire produced turmoil. When the Emperor Maximilian died in 1519, his grandson and heir, Charles V, was caught in a struggle with the French King Francis I to see who would sit on the imperial throne. Although Charles V was able to muster enough bribe money borrowed from the Fuggers to convince the rulers of electoral states to select him, he was ultimately unable to effectively control his empire. Also, as a ruler of the vast multinational empire that included Spain and its possessions in the New World, the Netherlands, southern Italy, and the Habsburg possessions in Austria, Charles had huge commitments. He was able to deal with the revolt in Germany for several critical decades because he was involved in extended wars with France, as well as with the powerful Ottoman Empire to the east. In the 1540s, the Schmalkaldic War was fought between Charles and some of the Protestant princes. While for a time Charles had the upper hand, and by 1555 he was forced to sign the Peace of Augsburg. This treaty granted legal recognition of Lutheranism in those territories ruled by a Lutheran ruler, while a Catholic ruler ensured that the territory remained Catholic. Radical Reformation. Historians sometimes use the term Radical Reformation to describe a variety of religious sects that developed during the 16th century, inspired in part by Luther's challenge to the established church. Many felt that Luther's Reformation did not go far enough in bringing about a moral transformation of society. One such group were the Anabaptists, who upon reading the Bible began to deny the idea of infant baptism. Instead, they believed that baptism works only when it is practiced by adults who are fully aware of the decision they are making. Eventually, rebaptism, as the practice became known, was declared a capital offense throughout the Holy Roman Empire, something on which both the Pope and Luther heartily agreed. Attacks against Anabaptists became even worse when the Anabaptists take over the city of Munster in 1534, during which time they attempted to create an Old Testament theocracy in which the men were allowed to have multiple wives. Following the capture of Munster by combined Catholic and Protestant armies, Anabaptism moved into the direction of pacifism under the leadership of Menno Simons. Besides Anabaptists, other groups such as anti-Trinitarians, who deny the scriptural validity of the Trinity, were part of the Radical Reformation. Both Catholics and Lutherans hunted down those who held such beliefs. Zwingli and Calvin. Shortly after the appearance of Luther's 95 Theses, Ulrich Zwingli's teachings began to make an impact on the residents of the Swiss city of Zurich. Like Luther, Zwingli accused monks of indolence and high living. In 1519, Zwingli specifically rejected the veneration of saints and called for the need to distinguish between their true and fictional accounts. He announced that unbaptized children were not, in fact, damned to eternal hellfire. He questioned the power of excommunication. His most powerful statement, however, was his attack on the claim that tithing was a divine institution. Unlike Luther, however, Zwingli was a strict sacramentarian in that he denied all the sacraments. To him, the Holy Communion was simply a memorial of Christ's death. It did not entail transubstantiation, as it did for both Luther and the Catholic Church. Zwingli was also a Swiss patriot in ways that Luther could not be called a German patriot. Zwingli was far more concerned with the world and called for social reform. He died leading the troops of Zurich against the Swiss Catholic cantons in battle. John Calvin was born in France, although he eventually settled in Geneva, Switzerland. His main ideas are found in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, in which he argued that grace was bestowed on relatively few individuals and the rest was consigned to hell. This philosophy of predestination was the cornerstone of his thought, and one that does not make any room for free will. This was contrary to everything that the Catholic Church taught about death. Although many of the Catholic Church practices, such as the sale of indulgences, were extremely corrupt, the Church also taught that people have the ability to save their souls following death. Calvin preferred for his followers to focus on correct living in earthly matters. He was a strict disciplinarian who did his best to make Geneva the New Jerusalem. He closed all the taverns and inflicted penalties for such crimes as having a gypsy read your fortune. Calvinism began to spread rapidly in the 1540s and 1550s, becoming the established church of Scotland. While in France, where the Calvinists were known as Huguenots, only a significant minority joined. In many ways, it can be said that Calvinism saved the Protestant Reformation because in the mid-16th century it was a dynamic Calvinism rather than increasingly moribund Lutheranism that stood in opposition to the newly aggressive Catholic Church during the Catholic Counter-Reformation. It also is worth noting that it was a group of English Calvinists who were called Puritans who grew tired of religious harassment from the mainstream Anglican Church and fled England to Holland. In the shipbuilding capital of Europe, they saved enough money to build a pair of ships which they used to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, where they established a new colony in Massachusetts based on religious freedoms. Yes, those were the Pilgrims. The English Reformation. The English Reformation was of a different nature, a political act rather than a religious act as the other parts of Europe. Henry VIII, the powerful English monarch, was supportive of the Catholic Church. He even criticized Martin Luther in the pamphlet that he wrote, The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Henry was never comfortable with Protestant theology. He did not believe in salvation by faith and saw no need to limit the role of the priest. The story of the English Reformation begins with what became known as the King's Great Matter, which involved King Henry VIII's attempt to end his marriage to the Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry had grown concerned that he did not have a male heir, and he began to question whether Catherine's failure to produce sons, a man of his times, he blamed his wife, was a sign of God's displeasure at his marriage to Catherine, who had earlier been married to Henry's deceased older brother. Because the Catholic Church did not recognize divorce, Henry would have to go through the process of getting an annulment. During this time, Henry fell in love with a young woman at his court, Anne Boleyn, who virtuously refused to sleep with him unless he made her queen. When the papacy showed no signs of granting the annulment, primarily because Catherine was the aunt of the powerful Charles V, Henry decided to take authority into his own hands. Starting in November 1529 and continuing for 7 years, he began what became known as the Reformation Parliament, which Henry used as a tool to give him ultimate authority on religious matters. This parliament would come to be very useful because by 1533, Henry was on a short timetable. He had bribed Anne Boleyn to join him in the bed. 3 months later, she was pregnant and had secretly married Henry, although Henry was still married to Catherine as well. If Henry was to be saved from bigamy and if his child was to be legitimate, he had only 8 months to end his marriage to Catherine. Henry decided that the only way to do this was by cutting off the constitutional links that existed between England and the papacy. In April 1533, Parliament enacted a statute known as the Act of Restraint of Appeals, which declared that all spiritual cases within the kingdom were within the king's jurisdiction and authority and not the pope's. A month later, Henry appeared before an English court, a church tribunal headed by the man he selected to be Archbishop of Canterbury. The tribunal declared that his marriage to Catherine was null and void and that Anne Boleyn was his lawful wedded wife. That September, a child was born, but it was a baby girl, Elizabeth Tudor, instead of a boy Henry so desperately wanted. Eventually, Henry would marry a total of 6 times. His third wife, Jane Seymour, provided him a son, Edward. In 1534, the English Reformation was capped off by the Act of Supremacy, which acknowledged the King of England as supreme head of what became known as the Church of England. While Henry may have been merely interested in creating what we might call Catholicism without the Pope, is in that he wanted to keep all the aspects of Catholic worship without acknowledging the primacy of the Pope. It proved to be difficult to stem the tide of change. Henry himself played a role in this by closing all English monasteries and confiscating their lands. The brief reign of Edward, his son Edward VI, saw an attempt to institute genuine Protestant theology into the church that Henry had created. But he died, and so his sisters took over. During the similarly short reign of Edward's half-sister Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and the wife of the fanatically Catholic Philip II of Spain, there was an attempt to bring England back into the orbit of Catholic Church. While succeeding in restoring the formal links between England and papacy, Mary found that many still held to the Protestant beliefs. To end this heresy, she allowed for several hundred Englishmen to be burned at the stake, thus earning her the reputation of Bloody Mary. It was only during the long, successful reign of her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, that a final religious settlement was worked out, one in which the Church of England followed a middle-of-the-road Protestant course from that point forward, and that's going to end